A senior clerk at Kensington Palace noticed that Prince William had personally signed a document that morning in his own hand that would normally be prepared and signed by aides on his behalf. The document was a draft family privacy protocol. The clerk did not raise it that afternoon. She only noted the signature in the private log and placed the document inside her senior office folder to be reviewed at the next weekly meeting. Music. She had worked at Kensington for 23 years, and she had never once seen the Prince of Wales personally sign a protocol draft. Prince William had not spoken publicly about the family's treatment by certain media outlets for over 8 years. Not once. Not in a public interview, not in an official statement, not even in a passing remark to a reporter at a scheduled engagement. William had held his silence for the entire span of his marriage, the entire early childhood of his 3 children, and the entire first years of his father's reign. But something had, at last, changed that morning. William had signed the family privacy protocol himself. William would speak publicly about it the following Wednesday, and a major royal change would be confirmed by the palace at the same hour. It was the first time in almost a decade that William would speak publicly on the subject his mother had once given so much of her life to. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William did not move from his desk for almost an hour that morning. The prince had spent the previous night reading 3 separate reports that Anne's private team had prepared over the previous 11 months. Each report documented a pattern of intrusive coverage that had, quietly and steadily, grown past a threshold William had once believed the palace could manage privately. Now holding the final protocol document, William felt only clarity. The family privacy protocol, in plain words, is a formal internal document that sets out how the royal family will engage with media, respond to intrusive coverage, and protect the privacy of its members and their children. The protocol had been drafted over the previous 7 months by a small team of palace advisors and had been reviewed quietly by Catherine, Anne, and Sophie in careful sequence. Charles had been kept informed of the drafting throughout, but had not seen the final wording until the previous evening. William had asked gently to be the one who signed the protocol first, before it was countersigned by the king. Charles had understood the request without needing to ask why. The protocol set out 4 specific changes. First, a new formal media accreditation system would restrict which outlets could photograph or film any royal family members' children under the age of 16 at any private or semi-private setting. A media accreditation system, in plain words, is a formal set of rules that decides which journalists and photographers are permitted to attend a specific event or cover a specific setting, and which are not. Second, a formal palace legal framework would be established to pursue privacy violations quickly, publicly, and consistently, without requiring each individual royal to file a personal action. Third, restrictions on drone photography near royal properties would be codified in coordination with civil aviation authorities. Fourth, and most importantly, William would step forward personally to announce the protocol in his own voice, breaking a public silence he had held on this subject since before his eldest son had started school. Catherine learned of the finalized protocol that morning. The princess did not raise her voice. She did not react quickly. Catherine only sat beside William, read the final wording, and understood immediately what her husband had decided to do. This was not just a document. This was a moment William had been preparing to make for years. Anne learned of the final wording that afternoon. The Princess Royal arrived at Kensington without an announced appointment. Anne read the 4 pages in the same steady silence that had carried her through every private storm inside the family. When Anne finished, she closed the folder, looked at William, and said only one thing. "It is the right moment." William nodded. The prince did not need Anne's approval, but he had wanted it, and he had received it. Charles learned of the final protocol that evening. The king read the 4 pages inside his private study, folded his hands on the desk, and looked out the window for almost 20 minutes before he spoke. Charles told William softly, that he had hoped this moment would come one day, and had also hoped it would not need to. But Charles also told William that the decision to speak was William's own, and that Charles would sign and endorse the protocol without asking for revisions. The public statement would be William's. Charles would appear beside him only if William wished it. William thought about it for a long moment. The prince said, quietly, that he wished to speak alone, not because Charles's presence would be unwelcome, but because the moment carried a weight William believed he needed to carry personally, in front of the country, without any shield of institutional support. Charles understood the answer completely. He did not press. He only agreed. The four reactions moved through the palace in a slow, spreading current. William felt weight first, then resolve, then the calm clarity of a man who had spent 8 years quietly preparing to speak. Catherine felt sadness first, then protectiveness, then the steady care she always carried when William stood at an important edge. Charles felt certainty first, then quiet grief, then the peace of a father whose son had, at last, prepared to say what needed to be said. Anne felt nothing new at all. The Princess Royal had already carried the conclusion inside her since the moment she had first opened the folder. Diana's shadow had not been mentioned aloud in any of the meetings. It had not needed to be. Every person in every room understood that the protocol William had chosen to sign, and the public silence he had chosen to break, was not just about the family's present. It was about a wound the family had carried for almost 30 years. And that wound, at last, was about to be named without being named. But the story behind the decision was longer than any one morning. And to understand what William was about to do, the story had to move backward. This did not begin with a signed protocol. It began 3 decades earlier, in the summer of 1997, when a boy of 15 had walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London and had, from that day forward, promised himself he would carry the weight of her memory without ever using it against anyone. William had held to that promise with a discipline few outside the family had ever fully understood. Through every difficult passage of the family's public life, through his university years, through his early duties, through the early years of his marriage, through the first years of his own children, William had held his silence on the subject of the media that had contributed to Diana's death. William had made small statements about the general importance of privacy. William had, once or twice, referenced his mother's memory in careful public tributes. But William had never, at any point across nearly 3 decades, spoken directly about the pattern of intrusive coverage that had followed his mother, and had followed him, and had begun to follow his own children. That silence had held through moments of enormous strain. It had held through the years of aggressive tabloid coverage that had targeted Catherine before their marriage. It had held through the intrusive coverage of Catherine's early pregnancies. It had held through the school gate photography that had begun following the family's older children from an age at which no child should have been photographed without adult consent. It had held through the drone incidents that had, in the previous 3 years, forced the family to change certain private routines. And it had held through the ongoing patterns of surveillance-style coverage that Anne's team had, quietly, been documenting for the previous 11 months. Catherine had known, from the earliest years of her marriage, how carefully William had held that silence. The princess had never asked him to break it. She had instead matched his discipline with her own, and had built her own approach to media coverage around the same principle. Both of them had believed for many years that private discipline would eventually turn the tide. Both of them had, quietly, watched that belief grow harder to hold. Anne had begun documenting the pattern almost a year earlier. The Princess Royal had noticed, in a routine security briefing, that a specific tabloid outlet had been running a pattern of coverage that appeared to draw on photographs taken at consistent intervals from a specific perimeter around one of the family's private residences. Anne had asked the family's private security team to review the pattern. The review had confirmed her suspicion. The photographs had been taken from a public road, but at a consistency that could only be explained by regular, planned surveillance. Anne had raised the matter with William quietly, at that stage, and William had asked her to continue watching. According to a private palace briefing prepared for the senior household in the following months, the pattern had reached a scale that palace advisors could not comfortably continue to manage privately. 3 separate incidents had, in the previous 6 months, reached a threshold that would previously have triggered a formal statement. Each time, William had asked the palace to hold the response internally. Each time, William had wanted to give the private route one more chance. And each time, a new incident had followed within weeks that had confirmed the pattern would not slow through private management alone. The final incident had come 3 weeks earlier. It had involved a specific piece of drone footage that had been offered for sale to multiple outlets, and had shown one of William and Catherine's children in a private garden setting where no photography of any kind should have been possible. According to a documented account later prepared for senior aides, William had received the review of the footage on a Wednesday evening, had read the security team's findings in complete silence, and had, without raising his voice, told his private secretary that he wished to convene a small internal meeting the following morning. Nobody in the household had needed to ask why. Sophie had been in that internal meeting the following morning. The trusted confidant had watched William describe in careful and unemotional language the pattern he had, until then, been asking the palace to manage privately. And Sophie had understood, in that meeting, that William had reached the point at which his private silence would no longer serve the family's protection. She had said nothing during the meeting, but she had, from that afternoon forward, quietly begun preparing every practical piece of support the family would need if William decided to speak. According to a documented account of the senior household's internal review, the family privacy protocol had been proposed at the second internal meeting, a week after the first. The proposal had come from a senior palace advisor who had drafted a similar protocol, in early form, more than 5 years earlier, and had held the draft in reserve. William had reviewed the early draft that same evening. William had asked for one revision. He had asked that the announcement of the protocol, if it came, be delivered by him personally in his own voice, without any prepared institutional shield. Catherine had asked William quietly and gently whether he was sure. William had said yes. Catherine had then asked one more question, whether Diana would understand. William had thought about the question for a long moment. And William had answered honestly. He had said yes. He had said that Diana would understand what her son was choosing to do, and that had been the moment Catherine had known the silence would end. Anne had, at that stage, taken over the coordination of the practical arrangements. The Princess Royal had helped shape the timing, the venue, the accompanying institutional statements, and the discreet legal support that would carry the protocol through its early implementation. Anne had not asked William, at any point, to soften what he intended to say. She had only asked once that he not speak for longer than he needed to. William had accepted the advice. Charles had been briefed on the full plan the previous evening. The king had listened without interrupting. Charles had, at the end of the briefing, asked William only one question, whether William wanted him present at the public moment. William had asked for a night to think about it. And the following morning William had told his father gently that he wished to speak alone. That was why the story had reached this specific Wednesday morning. Not because any single incident had forced the decision, not because any single meeting had triggered it, but because a pattern had grown over 3 decades, into a shape that only a personal breaking of silence could interrupt. And once William had signed the protocol, the story had no choice but to return to the present. William asked for one final family meeting on Tuesday evening. The prince did not use the formal channel. William asked quietly for Catherine, Charles, and Anne to gather in his private study at Kensington at 7. He asked for no aides inside the room, and he asked that Sophie be present, so that a trusted witness outside the immediate family would be able to remember the room's mood if it ever needed to be recalled. A private family meeting, in plain words, is a small gathering of close family members held to make decisions that will not be shared with staff or the public. Anne arrived first. The Princess Royal did not speak as she waited. Charles arrived next. The king took the seat closest to the window. Sophie arrived third and stood quietly against the wall without taking a chair. Catherine and William arrived together. Catherine did not sit down immediately. She stood beside William near his desk, holding a folder that contained the final draft of what William would say the following morning. William did not open with any introduction. The prince simply placed the draft on the desk facing the room and looked at each person in turn. He told them, briefly and honestly, that he had decided to speak, that the silence he had held for 8 years, and in a deeper sense for nearly 30, would end the following morning, that the protocol would be signed by Charles at the same hour, and that a formal palace confirmation would follow within the day. William asked then whether any person in the room wished to raise any concern before he continued. Charles spoke first. The king did not raise his voice. Charles told William gently that he had one concern, and one concern only. He asked whether William had prepared himself for the fact that his words, once spoken, could never be taken back or softened. William nodded. The prince said that he had prepared himself, and that he had, in fact, been preparing himself for this exact conversation for a very long time. Charles accepted the answer. He said nothing more. Music. Anne spoke next. The Princess Royal did not raise her voice either. Anne only told William that she had reviewed the draft twice, and that the wording was as measured as it needed to be. Anne offered no revisions. She only reminded William that the country would receive the words differently from any political statement it had heard before, because the words would carry the weight of who was saying them. William understood. Anne did not need to explain further. Then Catherine spoke. The princess did not stand any straighter. She did not raise her voice. Catherine simply looked around the room and said the line that would carry through the rest of the night. Diana would understand this, and she would be proud. The words were short, the words were exact, and the words landed in the room with a weight that no signature could match. Catherine had not defended the decision. She had only named the truth that no one else in the room could name in the same way. Diana had spent so much of her life trying to hold back the tide William was, at last, prepared to speak against. And Catherine had understood, before anyone else in the family, that Diana's memory would not have wanted William's silence to be permanent. Diana would have wanted William to speak when the moment was right, and this was that moment. William did not respond to Catherine aloud. The prince only walked slowly across to where Catherine stood beside his desk, took her hand, and held the moment steady for both of them. Charles watched, quietly, and in that small gesture between his son and his son's wife, Charles saw everything the coming morning was meant to protect. Sophie stepped forward briefly. The trusted confidant did not speak much. Sophie only reminded William that he had asked for a witness in the room, and that she was honored to be that witness. She said one thing more. She said that Diana had been her friend once in the years before Diana's death, and that Sophie had known even then that Diana's memory would eventually be carried forward by her sons in the way that only they could carry it. William looked at Sophie for a long moment. He did not speak. He only nodded once, slowly, in a way that Sophie understood completely. William felt weight first, then resolve, then the same steady presence he always carried when he stood at an important edge. Catherine felt sadness first, then love, then the same protective calm she always carried beside him. Charles felt certainty first, then quiet grief, then the peace of a father who had watched his son become the man Diana had once hoped he might become. Anne felt nothing new at all. The Princess Royal had already carried the conclusion inside her since the moment she had first opened the folder. William delivered the timing last. The prince did not raise his voice. William said only that he would speak the following morning at 11 from the steps of Kensington Palace, in front of a small selected press gathering. The protocol would be signed by Charles at the same hour, and the palace's formal confirmation would be issued within the day. Then William closed the meeting quietly. Everyone stood, nobody hurried, and Sophie left the room only after every other person had already stepped out through the door. William stood at the small window in his private study early on Wednesday morning, watching the light change slowly across the palace grounds. Catherine had not woken him. William had woken himself 2 hours before he needed to, and had spent the intervening time sitting quietly, without any paperwork in front of him, without any prepared speech in his hand. He had already memorized the wording. He had already lived with the wording for weeks. The morning did not need any more rehearsal. A private morning of reflection, in plain words, is the small quiet space a member of the royal family reserves for themselves before a major public moment, so that the moment itself is not entered from the noise of a schedule, but from the steadiness of a chosen calm. William had learned the practice from his father over many years, and had, in his own way, made it his own. Catherine joined him at the window an hour before the announcement. The princess did not speak. She only handed William a cup of tea, stood beside him, and looked out at the grounds with him for several minutes. When Catherine did finally speak, her voice was quiet. She reminded William that Diana's memory did not need to be carried heavily that morning. It only needed to be carried honestly. William nodded. The prince had known this, but he had needed to hear Catherine say it. Then Catherine said something William had not expected. She told him that their eldest son had asked the previous evening what William was going to say the following day. William had at the time given the boy a careful, child-appropriate answer. But Catherine now told William that their son had later that evening come to her privately and asked whether William was doing what grandmother Diana would have wanted. Catherine had, in that quiet bedtime conversation, told her son the honest answer. Yes, William was doing what grandmother Diana would have wanted. William did not speak for a long moment. The prince felt the weight of what his wife had just told him settle into a place inside him that no document could touch. His own son had understood at his young age what the day would carry, and that quiet understanding, arriving from the youngest member of the family, carried more meaning than any formal briefing could have carried. Charles arrived at Kensington an hour before the announcement. The king did not come to advise. Charles only came to sit with William for a short while, to hold his son's hand briefly, and to remind him that no member of the family would carry the day's weight alone. William received the visit with quiet gratitude. He did not say much. He did not need to. Charles understood without needing to be told. Anne arrived a half hour before the announcement. The Princess Royal did not come to reassure. Anne only came to confirm the practical arrangements one final time. She told William that the selected press gathering had already begun to assemble outside the palace, that Sophie had personally reviewed the accreditation list to ensure that the outlets present were only those the family trusted to report the moment with the seriousness it required, and that the palace's formal statement would be released within 7 minutes of William concluding his own words. Anne did not smile. She did not soften the delivery. Anne only stated the facts, and William received them the same way. Then Anne said one more thing, and she said it plainly. According to a later documented account prepared for senior aides, the Princess Royal told William that she had been present at Diana's funeral and had watched a 15-year-old boy walk behind that coffin with a discipline no 15-year-old should have needed to carry. Anne told William that she had, from that day forward, understood something about him that no one else in the family had needed to say aloud. William would carry Diana's memory his whole life, with the same discipline. And Anne told William that this morning was the moment where the discipline had, at last, chosen its own voice. William did not respond aloud. The prince only nodded once, quietly, and thanked Anne with his eyes. William felt honor first, then love, then the steady clarity of a son who had at last understood how carefully his father's whole family had been watching him for 3 decades. Catherine felt sadness first, then love, then the same steady presence she always carried beside him. Charles felt certainty first, then quiet grief, then the peace of a father who had at last watched his son step into a moment no one else could step into for him. Anne felt nothing new at all. The Princess Royal had already carried the conclusion inside her since the earliest reports. Sophie stood quietly near the doorway during the final 10 minutes. The trusted confidant did not speak. Sophie only held the door open when William was ready to walk toward the steps of the palace. Catherine walked beside him. Charles and Anne walked behind them, and William did not look back to check that his family was following. He knew they were. Music. By the time William reached the top step of Kensington Palace, the small selected press gathering had already assembled in respectful silence below. William did not carry any notes. William did not adjust his coat. The prince only paused briefly, looked out across the small gathering, and understood at that moment that 8 years of chosen silence had brought him to a place where the country would receive whatever he said next with a weight no ordinary statement would have carried. William took a slow breath, and then William spoke. William spoke for just under 2 minutes. The prince did not raise his voice. He did not read from any notes. William only stood on the top step of Kensington Palace, with Catherine standing quietly on the step below him, and delivered the words he had lived with for weeks. He did not name any single media outlet. He did not name any single incident. William only described the pattern the family had, quietly, been enduring across 3 decades, and he told the country plainly that the palace would no longer manage that pattern privately. A formal family privacy protocol had been signed by the king that morning, would take effect immediately, and would carry the full institutional weight of the crown. Music. Then William delivered the line that would carry across every screen in the country by the end of the hour. His voice did not tremble. His words did not stretch. William said simply, "The silence ends today. The protection begins today." The words were short. The words were exact. And the words landed across the country with a weight no royal statement had carried in decades. William did not add anything after the line. He only thanked the small gathering for their attention, turned quietly, and walked back inside Kensington Palace with Catherine beside him. The whole public moment lasted less than 3 minutes from the top step to the door. The palace released its formal statement 7 minutes later. A palace confirmation of this kind, in plain words, is a short official statement issued immediately after a member of the royal family has made a personal public statement, so that the country receives the institutional context at the same moment. This one confirmed the 4 major provisions of the family privacy protocol, listed the effective date, and stated clearly that the King, the Prince of Wales, and the Princess Royal had all signed the protocol in the previous 48 hours. Music D. A major newspaper carried the story under one careful headline that spread across every screen by midday. William speaks, the King signs. A national newspaper headline in plain words is the short, bold sentence at the top of a story that shapes how the public will read everything below it. This one mattered because it named William's voice and Charles's signature in the same short line, framing the moment as a family acting together rather than a single member of the family acting alone. The country did not receive the story with alarm. The country received it with quiet respect. The public understood from William's steady presence and Catherine's careful stillness beside him that the moment had been prepared with the seriousness it required. And most viewers understood, without needing to be told directly, that William's silence-breaking carried Diana's shadow across every syllable, even though Diana had not been named once inside the 2-minute statement. A national broadcaster framed the whole moment with one line during a midday bulletin. A national bulletin, in plain words, is a short news update read out at fixed times of day, meant to give the whole country the same version of the story at the same moment. The broadcaster said only this: "For the first time in almost a decade, the Prince of Wales has spoken." That sentence traveled quickly. It did not carry alarm. It only named what had happened. Outside Kensington Palace, a small crowd began to gather with white flowers, laying them near the gates in soft, careful rows. Kensington mattered because it was tied so closely to Diana's life and to William's own childhood. The flowers made the story feel less like an institutional protocol and more like a family reaching, at last, for a boundary Diana had never been given. Older women placed handwritten cards among the stems. Younger visitors stood quietly with phones lowered. No one shouted, no one protested. The silence outside those gates carried its own kind of witness. By evening, a second broadcaster framed the story with the line that would carry the longest. This was not a rebuke. This was a promise kept. That sentence traveled further than the first. It did not humiliate anyone. It did not exalt anyone. It only named what had happened, in language the country could carry home. And inside the palace, the household understood that the story had passed beyond their reach. The public had received the change, and no further explanation would be needed. Charles signed one final instrument that afternoon. The king did not summon a large audience. Charles simply sat inside his private study, read the wording twice, and signed. William countersigned an hour later. Anne signed as the third witness required by the amended rules. And the family privacy protocol was filed formally with the office of the Lord Chamberlain the same evening. The Lord Chamberlain, in plain words, is the most senior officer of the royal household, whose responsibilities include the formal record of the Crown's institutional decisions. Music. The signed protocol confirmed the four major provisions in institutional detail. It set out the media accreditation system for photography of royal children under 16. It set out the palace legal framework for pursuing privacy violations. It set out the drone restrictions around royal properties. And it set out the ongoing review timeline that would ensure the protocol was updated as media technology and coverage patterns continued to change. Anne read the final wording and offered no changes. The Princess Royal only signed her own copy and returned it the same afternoon. Anne did not celebrate the outcome. She only felt quiet relief that a boundary the family had needed for a very long time had, at last, been placed on the record. Catherine received her own copy in the presence of William. The princess did not comment. Catherine only watched William sign and understood, without needing to say it, that a boundary had been placed around their children's lives that their childhoods would carry more lightly than William's own childhood had carried the absence of it. Sophie carried the finalized document to the office of the Lord Chamberlain later that evening. The trusted confidant did not speak as she delivered it. Sophie only handed the sealed folder to a senior aide and left without waiting. She had done her part, and she would not need to do it again. Anne offered the final judgment inside a quiet corridor at Buckingham Palace. The Princess Royal spoke to William with the plain, steady tone that had carried the whole story. Anne told her nephew that a silence held for the right reasons was a discipline, but a silence held past its usefulness became a burden. William had, at last, put down the burden, and in putting it down, he had picked up a protection that would carry the family forward for a generation. The story reached its final truth inside those words. A family can survive a long silence. A family cannot survive a silence that lasts past the moment it should have ended. The monarchy did not weaken that week. The monarchy only demonstrated, again, that its most important boundaries carried their weight best when the family had prepared them privately and named them publicly at the right moment. William had broken his silence. The palace had confirmed the major royal change. But Catherine had named Diana's role in the discipline that had held William's silence for so long. Anne had drawn the practical shape steadily. Charles had signed with quiet grief and quiet pride. And Diana's memory had, at last, been served by the son she had raised to carry it. Prince William had broken his silence. The palace had confirmed the major royal change. And behind the 2-minute statement of a single Wednesday morning, a promise made at a mother's funeral almost 30 years earlier had, at last, been kept. If this story moved you, please take one moment to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of the royal family's most private struggles. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.